So my presentation is about narrating a story, telling you a story. But in the process of telling you the story, I want to also share with you some major concerns and major issues that not necessarily related to Qatar and the Gulf, but also related to all of us as people living in cities and dreaming about the best cities in the world and aspiring for the very best for all. So I have a sort of sequence, a sort of main issues that I want to share with you. One of which is the whole notion of our relation with nature, because water is part of nature, right? And therefore, I want to sort of challenge how we perceive water and how we perceive nature. And I want to also a bit talk about our contemporary urbanism challenges. And then I will move to the notion of city and water. And then what we can learn from interesting global lessons. And then I will end up with talking about Doha and coming up with a sort of conclusion that I would love to share with all of you. So nature is beautiful. We love nature. We appreciate nature. It's almost a spiritual to engage yourself in a natural situation. And nature is not only related to a specific geography. Each geographical context has its own beauty. So even the most dry zones on Earth, the deserts, they still have a different kind of beauty that also people can appreciate and enjoy. But my fundamental problem when it comes to our relation with nature is that we have a tendency to look at landscape and dealing with nature as a sort of a visual object. And I want to sort of engage you in a discussion related to the whole notion of moving from looking at nature to engaging with nature. And I think this is a paradigm that we need to consider. And it's quite interesting that when we look to the history of communities, and I'm absolutely 100% that was the case in all over China, and in Europe, in the States, and definitely in the Middle East, that we had a different kind of relation with nature. It was a very respectable relation because you have to adhere to the laws of this nature and you have to live in harmony. Not only that, nature was the source of life for people. So people live because of this harmonious and almost sacred relation with nature. But we moved in our modern time to deal with nature as a sort of a spectacle. And this is why I'm again invited to go beyond this spectacle. Sometimes we feel that our relation with nature is only about beautifying cities. So we put trees, we put palm trees, we put some green spots, but it's not doing anything. Or sometimes we imagine that all people have the ability to fly and enjoy the geometrical patterns that we do. And in reality, nobody's enjoying that. Nobody's able to perceive that because it's also one-dimensional kind of treatment. So how to move from beautifying cities to create patterns of social life? And it's amazing about nature that every single small act would affect the wholeness. So small treatments would lead to an inspiring whole. And this is the beauty of having each individual, each person should have his or her own responsibility about adding positively to the environment. Another interesting feature about our relation with nature, and I will quote here my dear Professor Christopher Alexander from University of California, Berkeley, who in his famous book, The Timeless Way of Building, he talked about quality without a name. Sometimes we experience situations where we enjoy, we sort of feel that it's a process of fulfillment, but we don't really have the ability to describe it. Sometimes we cannot even find the words, the just words to describe our feelings. And I think this is the beauty of our interaction with nature, particularly if it's in the heart of the city. So how within the proximity of the city, you create the spaces that would allow you to have those kind of experiences, quality without the name. And also, it's interesting that we preach all the time about protecting nature and protecting the environment and so on and so forth, but we are so afraid that when we will celebrate the Earth Day in 2035, we will end up with a poster and all our forests and all our nature is totally destroyed because of the swift urbanization and very harsh kind of new liberal urbanism that we see all over the world. Another challenge for us, and that was beautifully articulated in a wonderful book. If you didn't see this book, please go ahead and do that. The World Without Us. The move from green to gray and from gray to green. Instead of preserving the environment and live with it in harmony, we imposed our urbanization on it. And we, in the process of doing that, we moved all the way from green, lush, beautiful, harmonious environment into a very black, dark gray kind of environment. But it seems to me also that there's a revolution coming, and the signs of this revolution is becoming really, really articulated in different parts of the world. Here, an example in Hamburg, in Germany, where the social commitment, the collective commitment of the community is going towards creating a car-free city. I'm not talking about car-free neighborhood, a car-free street. We're talking about Hamburg, which is one of the most advanced cities on earth, but yet they have this dream of transforming the whole city into a car-free city, and they started what they called it the green web, the green kind of network, by transforming even some of the very critical highways into places for people. Oops, sorry. Every single urban designer and urban planner loves Jane Jacobs. And I would really invite you to read not only her books, but even her interviews, short essays, articles. And I like so much what she wrote here when she emphasized the fact that if you want to really create a city that would speak to people, you should also allow people to create the city. So the voice of people is fundamentally important. The idea of user participation is fundamentally important. But when I say user participation here, I'm not talking about what I call it after the fact workshops. When we're done with the designs, when we're done with the schemes, and then we invite some community representatives to look at our work and maybe share some comments with us. I'm inviting us to consider that the whole ideas and the whole concept should be generated from the initial interactions between us as professionals and the different community members. I think also we are approaching swiftly what I called it the second life paradigm. We fall in love with our smartphones. And in the process of falling in love with our smartphones, all our social needs are fulfilled via the screens. So we're not that much interested in talking anymore. I see in a lot of situations, I did document that in a lot of my research, that people go out to restaurants, to parks, to bars, to check their friends who are living somewhere else. And the rest of their friends, the actual friends that took all the hustle of coming with them to the same restaurant or the same park, are sitting around and everybody's checking what is happening with his Facebook friend across the Atlantic, right? So this is also dangerous because it's creating a culture of isolation, a culture of segregation, a culture of divorce between people in the community. To the extent that some places now are suggesting that we are no Wi-Fi zone. Come and talk, cannot go back here. Anyway, you can, so with that said, the importance of public spaces is becoming fundamentally crucial because positive public spaces are needed to help us to go beyond the paradigm of the second life. Okay. Now let me move to the whole notion of city and water, and I think waterfront is really interesting because waterfront is a kind of the intersection, the space where you will have a very interesting intersection between the land and the water. It's also related to history, usually to create a lot of layers of history. This is an interesting example from Singapore. But also water has a magic. It's again very similar to what I've said earlier, quality without a name. It's again the kind of resource that you will feel that you're literally doing a crime, preventing people from coming to water and interacting with water. We love to look at water, but we also love to interact with water, to physically feel water, to listen to water, to touch water. So all of these are also very interesting qualities. And also waterfronts, because of the climate change, are suggesting that we are in a very dangerous situation and we have to be very careful about our acts and the future of our cities and waterfronts and shores and so on, because we don't want to end up with situations like that. So we have to be extremely careful. And for something, to avoid such a result, we need, again, collective responsibility and collective effort to overcome these kind of dramatic. Now, let me move with you now towards some of the global lessons that I've been through myself. So this is not a sort of a Google-based research. All the examples that I would share with you here are about places that I've visited myself, that I had full hand experience in it. And in all of these experiences, I was so much excited about a different way of looking at the waterfront. I'm not that much excited about looking at the waterfront as a sort of an edge, as a sort of a shallow treatment of only the space where land and water would integrate and meet. I am more excited about how the waterfront can be seen as a context for development on the cityscape. And by saying that, I would suggest that the energy that you will have on the waterfront would penetrate and go inside the city. This is an example from the Middle East, Sidi Boussaid, beautiful city in Tunisia. What is interesting about this example is, again, the social commitment to preserve the architecture and urban character of the city. So suddenly you have a commitment from everyone saying that we will keep on producing intimate scale 2 and 3 floors kind of buildings, all of them in white with blue windows and doors. And they are doing that for decades. And you end up with qualities like that. Beautiful. The case of Barcelona and Spain is also very, very interesting. But in this specific case, I'm not only excited about the vibrancy of the waterfront, but I'm more excited about the main pedestrian road, that it's coming from the heart of the waterfront and penetrating the urban mass, going all the way to create a different kind of experience and connecting the city with water. Another interesting example is in Turkey, in Antalya and Bodrum, and how you transform the history, how you dig deep and read the narrative of the history. The two cities were literally fishermen villages, and then you use this as a base for new development without losing the character of the place. So you look at the past and you look at the heritage as a sort of an asset that you build on it. Another interesting, very famous example, even in all of the literature about urbanism, you will see something called the Bilbao effect. Right? This is a beautiful, again, city in Spain. It used to be a port, a commercial port, and then they suffered from a lot of deterioration because of a competition from different global trades around them, and that was the state of the city. And then a very, very brave mayor came with the idea that we need an icon in our city. And this cultural icon can sort of initiate a different wave of development along the waterfront and along the city, but it would be also sort of a place to attract people coming from all over the world. And suddenly you have an icon and a waterfront development move the city all the way from a very deteriorated place to a place visited by 10 million people from the tourists that visit Spain on a yearly basis, right? And you can talk endlessly about the kind of events and activities and so on and so forth. When it comes to waterfront, I think also the whole notion of the fair balance between the needs of the citizens and also what is needed for tourists is fundamentally important. You don't want to create gated communities along the waterfront. You don't want to create exclusive spaces along the waterfront. You don't want to create places that, by the quality of architecture and spaces and urbanism, you are actually writing a big sign to a big sector of the society. You're not allowed here. You cannot come here. You cannot afford to be part of our club. Another wonderful example in Seoul in Korea, where although you have a very concrete jungle, but within this rough jungle you were able again to have the social commitment and the authorities' commitment towards transferring a very tiny kind of water canal, or you can also call it river, you do that. But then suddenly, the beauty of this is that you created literally a green oasis within this concrete jungle, and you create a wonderful qualities, different qualities of people right across the street from the most kind of ugly concrete and glass boxes. So this is how nature and waterfronts can do, can add wonderful qualities and contribute dramatically to the livability of the place. In Oslo, Norway, again, very interesting waterfront that would start with the, believe it or not, the Opera House, and ended up with the Museum of Modern Art. And throughout the whole journey from the two icons, this is the kind of experience that you will have. People are having a wonderful time looking at water, interacting with water, eating by water, living by water, working by water, and so on and so forth. But what I was so excited about in the case of Oslo is their ability to transform two of the most sophisticated elitist buildings, the Opera House and the Museum of Modern Art, into places for people. So literally, you can go all the way from the waterfront, from the public space, and you take the ramp all the way to the top of the opera. And suddenly the Opera House itself is becoming a balcony to overlook the sea and to overlook the beautiful scenery. And the same goes like that. This is designed by Snorita, and this the museum designed by Renzo Piano. And they forced Renzo Piano to penetrate his beauty, his architectural icon, to allow people again to enjoy the public garden in the end of the walkway. And then you see a very, very small kind of design interventions, not necessarily sophisticated, not necessarily expensive, but you end up with, again, quality without a name. People walking, people having beautiful love stories, kids are bikes and mothers and families and shops and people working, and so on and so forth. Same goes with Vancouver, and the idea of developing the waterfront for people of the city, for the community, not for tourists, not for hotels, not for private developers and investors, but how to transform it into a community destination. The same with San Francisco and the whole idea of developing the piers, the perpendicular arms along the waterfront. With that said, I will move to the context of the Gulf and Qatar. And what is really unique about most of the Gulf cities, and when I say Gulf cities here, I'm talking about Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, Emirates, and so on, and Oman, and so on. All of these kind of developments went through very limited time frame. And suddenly we fall into the trap of what I call it the regional urban competition. Who will build the more, bigger, and higher? This is the Burj Dubai, Burj Khalifa, if you know about it. If not, watch Tom Cruise, Mission Impossible. He was able to go all over the tower, right? And at the same day when they did the inauguration of this tower, a Saudi investor said, we will build, what is the height of this one? They answered him, 880 meters. He said, okay, we will build 1 kilometer tower. So this is the kind of competition that I'm talking about. Or those kind of real estate fantasies that would only look like something if you have a plane. One would look like a palm, one would look like a pearl, one would look like a horse, and so on and so forth. But all of this was done because of the unprecedented oil revenues. But it seems that those days are over. We are approaching the post-oil and the post-carbon paradigm swiftly. If you want to have a concrete evidence, don't only talk about the decrease in oil prices, but also maybe oil will be irrelevant. This is the very first world solar plane that took a trip around the world. And they started from Abu Dhabi, which is the capital of UAE, United Arab Emirates, and they went all the way around the world and they came back. And the irony that they were flying on top of all of these skyscrapers. But what was interesting is that in the first leg, they traveled from Abu Dhabi to Muscat, Oman, which is usually 45 minutes flight. And it took them 6 hours. But we know technology. We know the power of technology. And we know that maybe they're doing this with solar power now in 6 hours, but maybe in 5, 10 years they will be able to do it in the same amount of time that you use it with the regular airlines. This is suggesting that maybe oil will be irrelevant, and therefore all those Gulf countries will be facing fundamental and even existential challenge. So with that, I want to move to the case of Qatar. This is a very interesting picture showing the sort of the atmosphere of the traditional parts of the city. And the Qatari people, they have very unique relation with water and with the Gulf because it was literally a source of life. They live because of water. So they go to fish and they dive for pearls. And that was the main source of their income. And this is, to me, a very interesting notion because whatever we are doing now in our contemporary time, we're still dealing with nature and with water as something to look at. This generation has a different kind of respect for for water and for nature because nature and particularly water was a source of life. And you can see that all the cities started with the small fishermen villages or small portal cities that would go to do some trading with India or Iran or different other parts. And you see also the impact of the Gulf in the evolution, the urban evolution of the city. This is the beginning of the city, and you can see that there's a huge respect as if there's an echo of the presence of water in the urban evolution of the city. And as I said, it's amazing the level of development that you can trace in cities like that. This is the case of Qatar. This is one of the most important hotels, a Sheraton hotel that was built in the late 80s and opened in early 90s. And this is the situation 5 years ago, and you can see the Sheraton here. So see the kind of development in minor decades. If you don't believe me, I prepared this map especially for you. This is Doha in 1937, 70 years. And this is Doha, this Doha is here now. And all of this is the outcome of the last 6 or 7 decades. You move from this to the waterfront, and those 4 pictures, the interval between the 4 pictures is only 2 or 3 years. So this whole change is within a single decade. Some might see this as development, but on the other hand, we have also to be very careful, because we need to stop and ask questions. Is this the right direction of urbanization? Is this the right direction of development? Can we in the first place call this development? And I think particularly when it comes to water and its relation to Qatar, it's important because of the relation with the post-carbon paradigm, as I explained. It's also related to the economic diversification, how we will move from oil-based economy towards diversified economy, and then how to also move towards different kind of centers of urbanism. First transformation was, as I said, our perception of water from a source of life to just a view, just you look at it. So these are examples suggesting that we moved from this kind of sacred relation into a relation where water was only a view. So this is what was a stage in the development of the city. Another interesting also transformation, that our relation with water was based on water was the place for the port, for the trade, for the market. And we moved from this to it's a place to have our towers, to have all of these glitzy towers. But also Qatar, and this is the location of Doha, Qatar is a peninsula, and you have a lot of water, a total of more than 600 kilometers. So it's a must to look at this on a sort of a comprehensive, holistic approach. And the challenges are how to see the waterfront as a catalyst for urban and economic development. To me, this is very important. I saw in a lot of presentations along the waterfront a sort of a classical image echoed in most of the presentation, I would say. People running along the water and people riding their bikes along the water. Well, this is beautiful, but waterfront should be beyond that. Waterfront should be seen as a place for development. Another challenge is because of the interaction between land and water, you have a lot of environmental conservation responsibilities. All these cities, as I explained before, are also related to heritage because they were old ports and you want to preserve the old urban fabric. And then how to create the waterfront as a place for all. Now there's also something very unique about Gulf countries, including Qatar. Only 10 up to 15% of the total populations are local, Qataris. And the rest are expats, people coming from all over the world to work. So sometimes this kind of awkward population anatomy might create a sense of, I don't belong to this place. I will leave in 2 years or 2 or 4 years or 5 years or whatever. So I'm not that much interested about the future of the city. And therefore, you need more effort to convince people that no, those places are geared also for you. And again, one issue is not to deal with the old waterfronts as sort of beaches. This is also a very interesting notion. We have a tendency towards dealing with waterfront as only places. So you just put some shaded areas and some surface and people will enjoy the waterfront. And I'm suggesting that waterfront is beyond that. So the move now, the strategic kind of paradigm shift that we are doing now, is that we look at the waterfront, particularly in Doha, as part of the whole urban context. And when I say urban context here, I mean open spaces, I mean the places where people live, I mean the main destinations of the city, I mean the places where people work, not only where people walk and ride their bikes, but where the actual life of people is happening. And every single city, even the small ones, are trying now to create their own narrative. And this narrative is not only along the water, but as I said before, it's penetrating towards the depth of the different towns and cities. And some of them is based on the, as I said, the architectural heritage and the urban heritage of the old places. And even the parts that it was kind of very late for us to deal with, like the areas where you have the skyscrapers and so on and so forth, we were able now to move part of the buildings, and we are transforming all of these water edges again into places for people. Now I want to finalize by a couple of very interesting examples very quickly. The Museum of Islamic Art, which is designed by the very famous Chinese-American architect Ayn Pei, beautiful piece of architecture. But what is interesting here is that because of the location of the museum, how to transform it into a place for people, how to transform the cultural kind of asset at the Museum of Islamic Art into a part of the places where people go to. It's a community destination. So we created here a wonderful park, an open park for people where they can enjoy a lot of activities that would create a different bond between people and the museum. And therefore, even visiting the museum is becoming now a byproduct of being in the park and enjoying the place. So you deliver a very strict and very concrete message that the waterfront is yours, that as a community member, and not necessarily Qatari, people are coming from all over the world to enjoy those kind of places and to have a good time with their families. Another interesting example is the museum, Qatar National Museum, designed by Jean Nouvel. And again, you see how the museum is not only inspired by the ecological assets of the context, and during the construction, it was a very, very sophisticated kind of piece of architecture. But what is interesting here is a couple of points. Number one, there are no boundaries. So the boundaries between the museum and the context and the water are becoming so blurred, and Jean Nouvel was so humble to listen to us and to understand that we need the museum to blend with the community, blend with the city, and blend with water. And therefore, we ended up with this quality of architecture and urbanism, that the museum is very well connected to the water, articulated around a chapter of the history, and you can penetrate the museum from different parts of the city. I will go back to Jane Jacobs to emphasize what I was trying to say in my presentation. Waterfront, it's not just something in itself. Waterfront is really connected to everything. And those are the lessons that we are working on in Qatar. Livable urbanism, holistic and fair, serve people and attract tourism and diversified economic alternative, and more importantly, a balanced urbanism and a community participation. So I want to end up with, although nature-based urbanism might sound a wonderful slogan, but I am inclined more to people-based urbanism, because when we think about people, we think about nature, we think about economy, we think about social issues, we think about cultural issues and heritage and so on and so forth. And thank you for having me.